welcome back to our receivable financing. This time we are going to focus on factoring. So, ano nga ba itong receivable financing? Sa mga hindi pa po nakakapanood ng ating overview of the receivable financing, panoorin niyo po yon at saka ng receivable financing focusing on assignments. Yung link sa mga videos na yon ay nandito po sa description ng video lecture na ito na factoring. So, kapag ang company nangangailangan ng cash for reason like paying its current obligations para hindi siya magbayad ng penalty, kailangan niya ng cash. One of the ways para makapag-raise ng money ang isang company ay itong tinatawag na receivable financing. So, itong receivable financing, ang pwede lang natin gamitin ay ang ating accounts receivable at ang ating notes receivable. Tatlong paraan ang pwede natin gawin sa accounts receivable. Nandiyan ang pledging, assignments, at ito nga pong factoring. You only have one way using our notes receivable, and that's what you call discounting. Okay? Pag-uusapan natin ang discounting in a separate video. This time, we're going to focus on factoring. So, ano ba itong factoring na ito? Factoring is a sale of your accounts receivable. Ibibenta mo itong accounts receivable mo. Factoring is also a transfer of ownership. By transferring the ownership of this accounts receivable to a factor. Ganito yan. So the customer owes the company and the company creates this accounts receivable. Then, itong si company nangangailangan siya ng pera, so ibibenta niya ngayon sa isang factor, sa bangko or other financial institutions or a finance company. And this bank or finance company, they are called the factor. So after the company sells the accounts receivable to the bank or to the factor, the company will then notify the customer of this selling of the accounts receivable. So after the company notifies the customer then will directly pay the bank or the factor. So ganito po yung transaction ng pag-transfer ng ownership ng company or pagbenta ng accounts receivable sa bangko or any other financial companies. So, itong factoring na ito, may dalawang klase ito. So, dalawang klase itong factoring na ito. The first one is what we call casual factoring, and the other one is factoring as a continuing agreement. So, ang casual factoring, this is a sale of your existing accounts receivable. So, this is a one-time transaction. So, binibenta mo na kung ano yung existing na accounts receivable mo. Okay? Alright, this is a sale of your existing accounts receivable. This is a one-time transaction. Okay, then the other one is a factoring as a continuing agreement. So, ano ba itong factoring as a continuing agreement? So, as the company generates an accounts receivable, automatic, itong company na ito, binibenta niya agad ito sa factor. So, sa accounting, itong casual factoring at factoring as a continuing agreement, magkaiba sila. So, in accounting, we are going to discuss the casual factoring and the factoring as a continuing agreement separately or individually kasi magkaiba sila ng accounting treatment ng factoring na ito. So, pag-usapan natin itong casual factoring. So, ano ba itong casual factoring? This is selling your existing accounts receivable. It is a one-time transactions. Okay? Paano tayo mag-uumpisa kapag nagbenta ang ating company ng kanyang accounts receivable sa bangko or other finance company? The very first thing that we have to do when the company sell our accounts receivable is to determine what is the carrying amount of this accounts receivable. So, ano ang una mong gagawin? titignan mo kung magkano ang carrying amount ng accounts receivable na binibenta ng company sa factor. To calculate for this carrying amount of the accounts receivable, we have our gross accounts receivable, then we less our allowance for doubtful accounts. Then this is your carrying amount of your accounts receivable na binibenta ng company. This is also what we call the net realizable value of your accounts receivable. Alright, let's say for example, we have accounts receivable of 100,000. Then, out of this 100,000, meron itong kasamang allowance for doubtful accounts. Let's say, for example, we have 20,000 na allowance for doubtful accounts nitong accounts receivable na ito. So, ang ibig sabihin, ang ating net realizable value of this accounts receivable or the carrying amount of this accounts receivable is 80,000. Alright? Then, from the carrying amount of this accounts receivable, ano pang gagawin natin? Ima-minus po natin ang selling price of the accounts receivable. Magkano ba natin ibinibenta itong accounts receivable na ito? So, we minus the selling price of the accounts receivable. And usually, itong selling price ng accounts receivable, sa problem, binibigay na yung amount. Okay? Sometimes the selling price is given as percentage of the accounts receivable gross or the carrying amount of the accounts receivable. Okay? Alright, so yan po yung selling price. Depende kung binigay na ng problem yung mismong amount ng selling price ng ating accounts receivable or binigay yung percentage kung saan doon mo kukunin yung selling price. And the difference between the carrying amount at ang selling price, ito po yung ating lost on factoring. Okay? Okay? So, for example, itong 80,000 na carrying amount ng ating accounts receivable na binibenta natin, for example, binibenta natin or nabenta natin ng 60,000. 60,000. So, we have 80,000 na carrying amount, ima-minus natin yung 60,000, ima-minus natin yung 60,000 na napagbentahan natin ng accounts receivable, ang ibig sabihin, meron tayong loss na 20,000. Most of the time, ang tinatanong ng problem is the loss on factoring. So, magkano yung loss ng factoring na yon? Okay? Now, our entry on this transaction is we debit the cash, kung magkano man yung cash na na-receive natin, usually yun yung selling price na accounts receivable. So, we debit our cash. So, we debit our cash of 60,000. We debit our allowance for doubtful accounts. So remember, our allowance for doubtful accounts, normal balance is credit. Okay? So kung aalisin mo na siya sa iyong accounts dahil binenta na natin siya, i-debit natin ang ating allowance for doubtful accounts. Okay? So debit allowance of doubtful accounts of 20,000. Then, we will recognize our loss on factoring of 20,000. Pag loss, syempre nakadebit yon. So, we debit the loss on factoring of 20,000. Then, we credit the accounts receivable of 100,000. Aalisin na natin yung accounts receivable natin na 100,000 kasi binenta na nga natin ito sa factor. So, we credit accounts receivable of 100,000. So, ito po yung transactions and journal entries ng casual factoring. Alright, now let's talk about factoring as a continuing agreement. So, this factoring as a continuing agreement is a continuous transactions between the factor or the bank or other finance company and our company. Alright, or continuous selling of the accounts receivable between the factor and the company. As the company generates this accounts receivable, automatic na binibenta na niya kaagad ito sa factor. How are we going to account for this factor as a continuing agreement? There are two things that you have to consider on this factoring as a continuing agreement. Ano itong dalawang charge ng factor? Si bangko, yung bumibili ng ating accounts receivable. And these are the commissioned or the factoring fee. And the other one is the factor's holdback, or also we call it receivable from factor. All right? Paano natin nakakalculate ang commissions or factoring fee? This is usually given as a percentage of your accounts receivable factored. So, nakocompute natin ito sa given na percentage sa problem. Alright? Ganun din dito sa ating factors holdback or receivable from factor. Okay? A percentage of the accounts receivable. A percentage of the accounts receivable. Diyan natin nakakalculate kung magkano ang ating factors holdback. Bakit nag-charge ang factor ng commission or a factoring fee? So, itong commissions and factoring fee, this is actually covers the credit approval, the billings, the collections, and the uncollectible accounts. Because the factor, nag-a-assume siya ng responsibility. So, the factor, yung bumibili na accounts receivable natin, usually the bank or other finance company, nag-a-assume sila ng kanyang responsibilities like credit approval, nagbibill sila sa customer, nagko-collecta sila ng accounts receivable, at also, they assume the responsibility of the account uncollectible accounts. So, yung risk na hindi nila makokolekta yung accounts receivable na yon sa kanila na yon. Bakit? Kasi sa credit approval, responsibility ni factor ng bangko. So, ang ibig sabihin, si company hindi siya makakapagbenta ng walang approval si factor. Walang approval si bangko or yung factor. Alright? So, hindi niya mapagbebentahan itong isang customer kung hindi ito inapproval ng factor. So, since the factor approves the credit on the sales of the company, they assume the uncollectible accounts. Alright? And they charge the company what we called a factoring fee. Kasama yan. Okay? Ina-assume na ng factor yon. So, pagdating sa company, wala nang pakialam si company kung hindi makakolekta si factor. Ganito yan. Itong commission at factoring fee, alright, itong commission fee na chinarge ni factor, si factor, income niya ito. On the part of the company will be an expense. Alright, so factors holdback. So, a factors holdback is also a percentage of your accounts receivable na gina-charge ng factor kay company. Okay? Hino-hold niya itong amount na ito to allow any sales return and allowances at sales discounts sa customer. Okay? So, itong factors holdback or receivable from factor, ina-allow natin ito for sales return and allowances at sales discount. Alright? So, ganito yan. Ang ating factors holdback, okay, is a percentage of your accounts receivable on the part of the factor. So, on this factors holdback, or the receivable from factors, on the part of the factor, it's payable to the company. On the part of the company, this is a receivable from the factor. Okay? So, these are the two things that you have to know when dealing with factoring as a continuing agreement. Okay? The commission or the factoring fee, and the factor's holdback or the receivable from factor. Usually, ito percentage ng accounts receivable. So, paano natin ito ina-account sa ating books? So, pag-uusapan natin ang ating journal entries ng mga transaction that involves the factoring as a continuing agreement. Okay? Alright, these are the transactions that involves the factoring as a continuing agreement. Alright? So, ito yung mga transactions na yan. Tapos, ang gagawin natin, ano ang mga entries natin sa mga transactions na ito? Alright, the first transactions kapag nagbenta tayo ng ating accounts receivable, to record this factored accounts receivable, we debit cash kung magkano man yung cash na na-receive natin from the factor. Then, we debit our commission fee. Or pwede mo rin gamitin yung factoring fee. Okay? And this commission fee account is an expense on the part of the company. Alright? So, ito, ilalagay natin sa income statement natin as an expense. Then, we debit our receivables from factors or factors holdback. So, gaya ng sabi ko sa'yo, yung commission fee and receivable from factors is a percentage of the accounts receivable. Okay? Then we will credit our accounts receivable. Okay, let's say for example, we factored an accounts receivable of 1 million. So, nag-factor tayo ng 1 million na accounts receivable natin. Let's say for example, the commission fee is 20%. And the receivable from factor or the factor's holdback is, let's say, for example, 15%. Alright, so the commission fee is 20% of the accounts receivable. Therefore, our commission fee is 200,000. Alright, then the receivable from factor is 15%, meaning it's 150,000. Then it's 150,000. Alright, so therefore, the cash proceeds that we receive from the factor is 1 million less 150,000 less 200,000 of commission fee. We receive a cash of 650,000. So, sometimes sa problem, hinahanap yung cash proceeds sa factored na accounts receivable. Alright? And sometimes, hinahanap din yung receivable from the factor. Alright? Then, alam mo kung paano mo siya i-compute. Now, another transactions, the sales return and allowances. Remember, our receivable from factors or the factors holdback. The reason why the factor is holding some amount of this is to allow some allowances or sales returns and allowances. Alright? So, let's say for example, mayroong nag-return na customer. Out of this 1 million, mayroong nag-return na customer na, let's say for example, 50,000. So, i-record natin itong 50,000 as debit to sales return and allowances and credit to receivable from factor. Alright? So, that's our entry kapag merong nag-returned sa mga customer ng kanilang mga goods or benta ng company. To record the sales discount, remember, on the sales discount, to encourage our customer to pay promptly, we offer a cash discounts. If you remember the terms like 2/10 and N/30. So that means if the customer pays the accounts receivable within 10 days or the discount period is 10 days, then they will avail a 2% of discount. Alright? Our entry for sales discount is debit to sales discount and credit to the receivable from factor. How much is our sales discount if everybody avails the 2% discount? So our discount will be 1 million less the 50,000. Okay, why less the 50,000? Kasi yung customer na nag-return ng kanyang goods, ay hindi siya makaka-avail ng cash discount kasi ni-return na nga po niya yung pinorchase niya sa atin. Therefore, our computations or calculations for this sales discount is 1 million less 50,000, which is 950,000 times 2%. And that's gonna be 19,000. Alright? Bakit natin niless yung 50,000? So, kung ako si customer, bumili ako ng 100,000 sa isang company, okay? Bumili ako ng 100,000, pero ni-return ko yung 20,000. Then, binayaran ko yung remaining within the discount period. 2% of the 80,000 lang ang maa-avail kong discount. To record the collections of the remaining receivables from the factor, we debit cash and we credit the receivable from factor. Alright? So, debit to cash and credit to the receivable from factor. So, how much cash ang matatanggap natin sa factor this time? So, kung titignan mo yung ating account na receivable from factor, ETT account natin, okay, we debit 15% of the accounts receivable of 150,000. Okay? So, meron tayong debit na 150,000. Then, we credit from the sales return transactions, we credit the receivable from factor na 50,000. Tapos, nag-credit ulit tayo ng sales discount na 19,000. So, ang ibig sabihin, meron pa tayong naiiwan sa debit side na 80,000. So, yan ang matatanggap natin sa factor. Okay? So, we will collect this cash of 81,000 from the factor. Then, we will credit receivable from factor. Alright? What if there are accounts receivable na finactor natin kay factor na hindi niya masisingil? So remember, the commission fee includes the uncollectible accounts. The factor assumes the responsibility of the uncollectible accounts because the factor also has the responsibility for the credit approval. Si company, wala siya ngayong allowance for doubtful accounts. Kasi, pag-generate niya na accounts receivable na yon, fina-factor na niya kaagad. Binibenta niya kaagad kay factor. So, wala siyang allowance for doubtful accounts. These are the journal entries, the transactions in the journal entries that involves the factor as a continuing agreement on factoring. Next video lecture will be discounting. So, sa discounting naman, involved ngayon ang notes receivable. I'll see you there.